Hello, fellow mech warriors, Mage Leader here. Welcome back to another episode of the Battlemech Primer, the series where I ignore clan mechs because clanners are cringe. In our previous lecture, we discussed a light electronic warfare mech, a zippy little bugger that emphasized speed and special equipment over raw firepower. Today, however, we're going to take a little journey to the opposite end of the spectrum. A mech so overloaded with sheer destructive capability that it's still viable even in the Ill-Clan era. I'm joking, of course. None of the fun mechs are viable in the Ill-Clan era. But it comes a hell of a lot closer than most, and despite its relatively brief time in the spotlight, it has made a massive impression on the battlefield. Today, we're taking a look at the Annihilator. The Annihilator is a battle mech that lives up to its name. It's a 100-ton behemoth, an imposing beast that was born from the death throes of the Star League. The first Annihilator was built in 2780, just a little bit before the Exodus. At the time, the reasons for designing it weren't entirely clear, and the thinking behind it, as well as whose bright idea it was, are largely lost to the fires of history. Back then, the SLDF was on the offensive, and was most interested in battle mechs that could bulldoze the forces of the Rimworld's Republic on the battlefield. They needed machines with power and mobility, strong attackers and brawlers, but apparently somebody saw the need for a point defense machine, and enough people agreed that the design was eventually greenlit. There are numerous theories as to why this may have been done. Perhaps Kerensky or his generals anticipated a counterattack from the great houses once the war was over. Perhaps they wanted a mech better suited to peacekeeping cities out in the periphery. Or maybe all the nuclear devastation and horrific loss of life the war had caused had driven them all just a little bit crazy. You be the judge. Whatever the reason, they built a massive assault mech, one of the heaviest, beefiest, and slowest machines ever created. The idea behind the design was about as straightforward as you could get. The Annihilator was meant to stand in one spot, preferably a prepared position with lots of cover, and then shoot anyone stupid enough to wander into its sightline. With a top speed of 32 kph, it was not a sprinter and a very poor brawler, unable to keep up even with mechs of its own weight class. But what the Annihilator lacked in speed, it made up for with armor and raw firepower. Of course, as stated before, the design wasn't well suited to the kind of campaign the SLDF was running at the time, and so it saw very little use in the Inner Sphere. And when Kerensky chickened out and fled the Inner Sphere, he took all the existing Annihilators with him, though some unconfirmed reports claim that he left a few with the comm guards. As a result, the mech vanished from Inner Sphere records until about 3009 with the arrival of the Wolf's Dragoons. Who are the Wolf's Dragoons, you ask? Well, to keep it brief, they're a bunch of filthy, rotten clanners. Or at least they used to be. And then they weren't for a while, now they are again. It's complicated, but I'll try to sum it up. When the SLDF left the Inner Sphere, they would eventually mutate and turn into the clans. I'm sure most of you know about that already. A whiny mama's boy named Nicholas Kerensky designed their entire society, which is probably the reason why it's so weird and nonsensical. Thankfully, Nicholas would eventually buy the farm, and without his misguided guidance, the clanners began to wonder what their purpose was. Some thought they were supposed to go back to the Inner Sphere and murder all of its puppies, while others thought that they should stay where they were and mind their own fucking business. The debate went back and forth for a while until a particularly unlucky Inner Sphere exploration vessel happened to jump into their territory. The clanners, after catching, interrogating, torturing, and mercilessly slaughtering the crew, decided to do what clanners do best: make a snap decision based on poor intel and do something stupid. They decided to invade the Inner Sphere. However, someone with an actual functioning brain pointed out that it had been a long time since they'd left, and maybe they should gather some information first. It was for this purpose that Clan Wolf selected a number of volunteers to go out and spy on the Inner Sphere, posing as mercenaries. These men and women, if you can even call a clanner by those terms, would come to be known as the Wolf's Dragoons, and they would be equipped with a bunch of outdated equipment so as not to raise suspicion. Outdated equipment such as an old Star League mech most Inner Sphere people hadn't ever seen, and a bunch of Mad Cats. As some might see this as self-defeating, but in their defense, clanners aren't very good at history, so it's not entirely impossible that they forgot those little details while outfitting the Dragoons. The arrival of the Wolf's Dragoons would bring the Annihilator back into the spotlight. Usually, a merc company showing up with their own special mech designs isn't that uncommon. Hell, if you've got the C-bills, even you guys can design your own, but the Annihilator drew a little more attention, mostly because the Wolf's Dragoons decided that the best way to spy on their targets was to be as conspicuous as fucking possible. They didn't just come back and take on tasks as mercenaries. No, they rapidly became one of the most famous units in the galaxy, kicking ass and taking names while almost never failing at anything they ever did. Some might call that lazy writing. On top of that, the Dragoons would establish the Mercenary Review Board, which quickly became the default way to hire mercenaries. So when they showed off their special Battlemechs, people took notice. Lucky for them, nobody really questioned why a suspiciously well-equipped unit of professional warriors had just shown up out of nowhere, and their cover somehow remained intact. Some might call that oddly convenient. Plot armor aside, the Annihilator drew a lot of eyes, not only due to its imposing presence on the battlefield, but also because of how effective it was in its intended role. The Annihilator is a defensive weapon, best used to hold a choke point or to protect an armed emplacement. In its original configuration, the ANH-1A, it was armed with 4 AC-10s and 4 medium lasers, a loadout that can put almost any Battlemech on its ass in a matter of seconds. While the Annihilator was often a tempting target with its slow speed and massive silhouette, its weapons ensured that very few machines could engage with it directly. Trading damage with one of these things is what most mech warriors call a shitty idea. On top of that, even if you do manage to get off an alpha strike before buying the farm, with the sheer amount of armor it's packing, you'll be lucky to even scratch the paint. Because of this, the Annihilator is exceptional at urban combat and in environments with large amounts of cover, where its slow speed is less of a disadvantage. If it can control the enemy's angle of approach, then it's nearly impossible to get past without sacrificing huge numbers of men and material. You could try to get it to shoot until it runs out of ammo. At least you could if you're a Cretan who thinks suicide charges are a good and honorable way to do combat. But all that forward firepower is an Achilles heel. The Annihilator is sluggish on the move and vulnerable from most directions. The key to dealing with one is as simple as going the fuck around it, or bombarding it with massed artillery. While it can take a pounding, it's far from invincible, and its rear armor is nowhere near as tough as its front. And if you manage to close with it, it's incredibly easy to run circles around it and stay in its rear arc. Light mechs are the bane of its existence, and most Annihilator mech warriors have a horror story or two about the Commando or Locust that just refuse to die. Today, the Annihilator is more common. Wolf's Dragoons eventually licensed the design to Ark Royal Mechworks as a thank you to fellow Mary Sue, Phelan Kell. The intent was to prepare to fend off the Word of Blake Jihad, but, well, we all know how that turned out. Despite the best efforts of the suicidal Blake-worshipping morons, the Annihilator remained in production, and Ark Royal continued pumping out the machine for years to come. In 3146, Clan Jade Falcon would take Ark Royal in one of the worst-written time periods in Intersphere history. Jade Falcon bombarded the planet from orbit, and what became of the Mechworks factory is currently unknown. But given that the Annihilator seems to keep popping up in the salami units that the Falcons left behind during their march to Terra, most of us assume that the factory is still chugging along. And now that the Kellhounds have retaken Ark Royal, the Annihilator likely has a bright future of kicking clanner ass ahead of it. So that's the Annihilator. It's a reminder of darker, more desperate times. A final exclamation point to the Ameris Civil War brought back to life by a bunch of Mary Sues from deep space. It's a sluggish powerhouse, built to lay down an absurd amount of firepower in a brilliant display of fuck that thing in particular. While it's not going to win any races, or beauty pageants for that matter, it's a useful machine for when a line absolutely must be held at all costs. When your back is up against a wall, there's no better mech to have in your corner. Thank you all so much for watching, and a special thank you to my patrons: Arkros Raid, Spacer, Robert H., Rivius, Kyle Vidari, Metal Dragonar, Tim Cook, Tomoyoga Tudor, Gary Moses Sweeney, Admiral Chirano, and Z. If you would like to join Maid Squadron Certified Mech Warriors, then consider joining up via the link in the description. You can also register your name with our unit via the red subscribe button, or by leaving a comment down below. Your support keeps me fed and the regiment in high spirits. Thank you once again, and until next time, this is Mage Leader, signing off.